I just want to be clear that I'm not any kind of
We're
monster,
live, by
right?
the way, just a heads up. Sorry, I clicked the button just as you started talking.
Yeah, no problem. I just want to start by clarifying. I don't know why. What's his name again? Sorry.
The host,
Yeah,
Nathan.
Nathan. Yeah, I don't know why he said that we were going in a Nazi kind of direction, but I am not a Nazi. I am a relatively
No.
normal,
I wasn't
normal
interpreting
person.
it that way at all. The thing is, as soon as you get into like when you look at people like J.F. Garepi and whatnot, there's a strong tendency to use sort of like a natural selection approach to culture, to explaining culture, that leads you into a space that's very amenable to alt-right talking points, and I think that's sort of where he was getting kind of iffy. I didn't get that impression at all. I think that the argument that morality is a product of biological evolution is pretty ubiquitous in these circles. I think it's very wrong.
I think they're right about that specifically, but that doesn't make me subscribe to their other beliefs and myths, such as the belief that white people are magic and the solution to all of our problems, which is a very
totally
common
fair.
one that you hear in their circles, for instance.
Yeah. So you've had a bit of time with Nathan to sort of hash things out a little bit. I was struggling to get onto the stream, but for whatever reason, my wireless adapter was just being uncooperative. So maybe it would be productive to start with if you just wanted to like briefly give your account.
Right. Okay. So
if that's not asking too much, again, I recognize that you've already done so just minutes ago.
No, it's all right. In the previous conversation on his channel, some dude that I happen to know came and tried to defend amorality in my opinion, in what was a very clumsy way.
Just for clarification, you're saying a space morality or amorality?
Amorality.
Okay.
In one word. Right. And so I came here to sort of try and clarify his positions. Like he was drunk. To his credit, is not always like that, but he did link me to the discussion. So that was a bit painful to watch, right? And so I tried to give a bit of what I think are solid arguments in favor of it. So I started with a more philosophical argument, which is that morality defined as a perspective independent collective value is something that, if we accept the definition as a value as something that is always defined with regards to another value, you can do some kind of an infinite regress, and you arrive at the conclusion that there is no, well, that's what Meach said, right? That there is no foundation for value at the bottom of it, right? At the bottom of it, nihilism is right. There is no value to be found if you go all the way up. And so there is certainly no perspective independent collective value to be found either. So that's the philosophical argument in its short form, right? And then I gave two arguments based on evolutionary theory. The first one is more of a suspicion that I think we should all have with regards to morality, which is that considering that we are evolved beings and that the brain is an evolved organ like the rest, all of our heuristics and moral instincts are also evolved. And the fact that they are evolved means that they were shaped not by any kind of moral principle, but by selfishness, essentially, by the fact that it was valuable to have these instincts for the people who held them. And so that's more like a suspicion, right? That doesn't really argue against morality in and of itself, but it makes you sort of doubt your moral instincts if you see them as just a collection of rules of thumb that are there to help you extract resources from society, essentially. And And the other point with regards to evolution is that specifically altruism, but I think altruism can be argued to be a core part of all moral systems. Altruism cannot evolve. It cannot evolve on a large scale. It can exist in
Sorry, can
particular
you just
cases.
restate that last thing you said? Sorry, altruism.
Cannot evolve is what I'm saying. Altruism, defined as, sacrificing some benefit for the benefit of someone else.
Okay.
It's a trait that cannot
So we're
evolve
talking
in-
strong altruism, so it can't even be for the benefit of your family group's sake. They're
can
completely
be for the-
denuded of any benefit
it can be
identified
for
with
you. It can be for the benefit of your direct descendants, and there is some shenanigans around close siblings, but I would argue that even kin selection is incorrect in that it states that that kin altruism can evolve. Like, the only reliable kind of altruism that we find in nature is parental investment. Is my point. And parental investment is not exactly altruism, right? Because in a sense, you're helping yourself.
Right. So there's a temptation here where I really want to push back on the idea that altruism has no evolutionary value. I think that's what Nathan was getting into, and I think that was a bit of a mistake. Because I think you put your finger on something when you indicated that for it to be a moral thing specifically, altruism has to be completely disinterested. It has to be completely pure of any practical consideration whatsoever. It has to be for another being altogether with no benefit.
Right. If it's mutual benefit, it's cooperation.
Yes, even at a distant level, because you can always say, well, that wasn't actually a moral action. There was an interest in it. And maybe the interest was greater or minor or lesser. You had an interest in it. And morality as a description of the moral as a description of the choice that you made is superfluous.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I think you got my point.
Yeah. So I think you're right. However, I also think this doesn't actually touch on morality, the question of morality at all, for the simple reason that as soon as we're, again, denuding it of any practical significance, well, what we've basically stated is that its evolutionary value simply cannot play a part in its definition. So it may indeed be the case that pure altruism has no survival value, and then we may think to ourselves, well, it's therefore absurd to predicate a society.
Right. Yeah, that's the point I what's it called? Conceded to Nathan, which is that evolution is not a value theory; it is a truth theory. It is descriptive, not prescriptive, right? So it's the conclusion that you can, the things that you can derive from evolution regarding altruisms are not a demonstration; it's an implication. And in much the same way that you might really want to build a car made of air, and that physics doesn't tell you that you shouldn't build a car made of air, but it tells you that it's impossible. In much the same way, in my opinion, at least, evolution doesn't tell you that you shouldn't be altruistic or that you shouldn't be moral. It tells you that anything that you do can either be selfish or selecting for selfish behavior, or selfish trait, I should say.
Sorry, anything you do selects for selfish traits.
Yeah, anything you do is either selfish and thus favoring you, or it's altruistic and then it's selecting for the competition, right? The more selfish elements that are competing with you for existence.
Right, and this is supposed to establish, or this is supposed to be an argument towards moral anti-realism.
Well, it's not establishing that you shouldn't be moral. It's establishing that it's pointless to be moral.
But I mean, wouldn't that that almost seems to be baked into the definition of morality, though, isn't it?
Right. It's
like that's kind of the point.
Yeah, it comes from thinking about the definitions. And when you think about the definitions and your worldview as a whole, you realize that you have this unnecessary part, which, in my opinion, can be excised and should be excised, because morality, as a form of collective delusion, can guide you into error.
Well, what kind of error? Is there a normative preference to biological flourishing that we're invoking here, extrinsic to, of course, the bare fact of that biological flourishing?
Well, discussing the implications of biology for society is a very taboo thing for a reason, is because all of the examples are kind of assaultish, right? But one example.
Well, let's talk at the level of the species, right? Let's assume there's just one city on Earth. We don't need to talk about anything to do with, and we'll add additional factors in. Let's say, or we'll remove factors. Let's say it's a single ethnicity. We reproduce asexually, so there are no gender or sex distinctions that are recognized by society. People are just kind of indifferent to how you act and dress, things like that.
It's not even about discrimination. It's about, like, for instance, this tells you that charity is pointless on a societal level. Like welfare, for instance, is, well, welfare, at least without a stabilizing feedback loop, is pointless, because it just creates a niche to exploit. It just creates well,
I mean, it's clearly not pointless. People do it to an end. So my immediate question is,
it might not be pointless to the politicians who use it to get votes. That's true.
Well, what about the person who does charity to improve the lives of citizens?
Well, they get clout for it. So
not necessarily. If you do it anonymously, or if you do it, like there's for example, we were discussing Christianity earlier. There's that whole idea in the New Testament of don't let your left hand see what your right hand doeth. You can absolutely do charity for the end of somebody else's well-being without getting clout for it. That's not a given.
That's one example where it would be individually beneficial to know that it's pointless, because then you wouldn't do it unless you got some benefit for it, like clout or virtue signaling or something like that, right? I was talking about the collective. As a collective, our type of automatic charity, like if you are below a certain level of revenue, you get free resources, right? This is also pointless as a society, because the fact that altruism cannot evolve also implies that altruism, if realized, is self-defeating.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, so
it selects for more selfish life forms, which will exploit this weakness, right? Which will exploit this.
You think altruism selects for more selfish life forms?
Right. Exactly.
Can you elaborate on that? I had another point I'm going to make, but I just want to hear that first.
If you're an altruist and your brother is a selfish person and you give him your free shit, you're favoring his phenotype over yours.
Well, slow down. Altruism doesn't mean necessarily that you simply wantonly give all of your stuff away at random.
Not all of your stuff, but some of your stuff.
Sure, but I mean, you tend to select based on what will actually do the most good. So, for example, in the case of charity, we don't just give away all of our stuff to Jeff Bezos because he's able to ask the loudest. We give our stuff away to people who are suffering, and incidentally farther down the road. And again, like, this is where it stops being morality and starts to have practical significance.
Right.
It contributes to a situation in which you don't have masses of people who are now negatively invested in the well-being of your society.
Right.
Right. If you have lots of people who are suffering and don't have access to the basic needs of living and who are living in an aggravated and impoverished existence, you get revolutions.
That's
you
true,
get the dissolution of communities.
By doing that, you just get more. You don't get less of it.
You think that if the French revolutionists were less hungry, they wouldn't have revolted? Were more hungry, they wouldn't have revolted?
Yeah, it might be valuable to the elites to do that. It might be valuable to, like, the top echelon of society to do that. It might be useful to them. I mean,
well, I mean, there was a revolution. They weren't the top. They weren't the top echelon of society. The top echelon of society.
I'm not talking about the peasants. I'm talking about the rulers, right? if we're talking about,
You're talking about members of the third estate. These were not the tops of society. Again, like they
yeah, but
had to.
that's not what I was talking about.
Oh,
Yeah,
Lord.
okay. So yeah, they tried to topple. They actually toppled the government. Let's say because they were hungry, right? Hungry, and
Right, great. Sorry, keep going.
yeah, both really, and this might have been stopped if the government before that decided to create some kind of a welfare state, or let's say a more fair society where people would get their say and all. And well, yeah, you wouldn't have had a French Revolution, and maybe. So what? Like doing that would have benefited the top echelon. It would have
Well, it
benefited
would have.
the,
Well, hang
the
on. It would have
lower echelon.
definitionally. It would have
But
benefited everybody. The top echelon would have held onto power. The society of itself, if we're talking about the well-being of the community as it stood, that would cohere. That wouldn't be demolished and then restructured into an entirely new form. And the people at the bottom would have a basic standard of living.
I will give you this point because it's true that in the short term, you can have good effects from this policy, right? Which is sort of incidental, right? It's social stability at the cost of creating a long-term niche for selfish freeloader behavior, right?
How is it creating a niche for freeloader behavior?
Well, can't you answer this question? Like, if there is welfare in a society, there is a niche for freeloader behavior. That's
where does the welfare come from?
From the people who pay tax, presumably.
Okay. So, all right, and they pay that in the form of money. And where does the value represented by that money come from?
From the scarcity of money and from what it can be exchanged for.
Exactly. So you're at the end of the day, the wealth that the state is able to actually dole out, referring to real wealth in the sense of whether or not it's money that can buy food or food directly, that is going to be produced by people at the bottom. You're not talking about freeloaders. You're talking about the people who actually make the stuff.
Well, not in the case of a welfare state, though.
Yes, also in the case of a welfare state.
No, in the case of a welfare state, you're giving this money to unemployed people, for instance. I told you this was an assholish argument, right? It makes me look like a very bad light, I know. But, it's for the sake of argument, right?
You're giving people money, though, in a welfare state so that they can be productive members of society, right? It's you can't. Have you ever
right.
if you're trying to find a job or if you're trying to make something of yourself, being homeless is extraordinarily tiring.
Well, I haven't been homeless, but I have struggled a lot. And well, my family has nothing, and they are welfare state parasites, right? My parents actually. Well, my father has 5 kids and hasn't worked a day in the last 20 years. So I know this topic by it's not self-advocacy of me to go against charity. It's not because I'm a wealthy person who.
No, neither am I. It's fine. It just doesn't work.
Right. So what
Look, I'm from
a
lower class family that has members that field these same arguments. This isn't new to me.
Okay. So the point is that if you create that possibility of getting money from the state, money which can be exchanged for goods that you didn't produce, right? You create that possibility of not working and getting enough resources to live. And well, you make it possible for people to exploit this to reproduce at the expense of the majority. Isn't that true? You make it possible. I'm not saying they're doing it, although I am actually saying they're doing it, some of them at least. But you're creating like a niche of growing freeloaders, which lives in a certain environment with abundant resources in the form of welfare, and they are just going to, as populations do, in nature or in society to shoot up until they reach the limits of their environment, and that's it.
Okay, I don't know about that. But again, like we come back to this ultimately. You're characterizing people who, again, benefit from state welfare as being freeloaders. I mean, leaving
Right.
aside the fact that you can, if you've ever lived on welfare, you know that this basically just covers the bare standards of living. These people are not living it up in any way that would make remaining on welfare desirable in a long-term sense. But besides that, again, like the people who are paying these taxes, that again, where is that wealth coming from?
Well, not from the people who are on welfare. Some of it comes from, the
A lot of people who
the
are on
lower
welfare
end of the
work.
workers. That's true. Some of it
There
comes
are
from
there
there.
are like we're in a gig economy, right? A lot of people can only get part-time work or work that only sustains itself seasonally. So people who are on welfare, this allows them to survive in between jobs, or to take care of children if for whatever reason they can't work, or to survive if they're sick.
Right.
It's not a good thing. It's actually bad for society to have masses of people who have a choice between appropriating stuff unlawfully or starving.
Well, welfare can be sustained if there is a kind of a feedback loop, and there always was some welfare, right? But there needs to be, for lack of a better word, there needs to be a check on their reproduction, because, well, it is my experience, at least, that it is the case that people do use welfare and do use it to reproduce at the expense of the
I
majority.
thought you just
without
prefaced this by
contributing.
saying you
Well,
weren't going to go into the alt-right thing, and now we're talking about
Well,
a
I'm not ultra.
child
haven't-
limits on the poor.
Well, that's not a very popular idea in the alt-right, I don't think. They would rather like to sterilize black people, I suppose. But that's not what I'm about. I mean, it's not black people.
It doesn't strike me as better, though.
Well, if you say so, then that's a moral judgment, I guess. Which I'm not.
Well, I mean, it is a moral judgment. It's also a practical one. It's extraordinarily bad, again, to have not just masses of
You
people
can have
who are
some welfare.
deprived.
Yeah.
Okay, but why some welfare? Where are we now backpedaling onto some welfare?
Because you can have it if there is a kind, either a legal punishment for it in the form of sterilization. You don't have to have that, but that would work.
So
right?
if somebody is unemployed and they are forced into a situation where they need to access government welfare in order to survive and feed their kids, the penalty is they have to be chemically sterilized.
I'm not saying that's the only way, but that would work. Another way, if you keep it at a low level, is that there can be a social punishment for welfare, and that's how it presumably existed for so long, right?
Why would you socially punish people for being poor?
Well, they are being socially punished for being poor by being.
Yes, they are. That's the point. Like,
yeah,
they already have an invested interest in not being poor. Why do you need to?
Right.
You know?
The social punishment comes in. Well, the social punishment to freeloader reproduction comes in the form of not being desirable mates.
What?
If you have, like, if you're very poor and on the dole, right?
Yeah.
You're
quite possibly a student. You're quite possibly an artist. You're quite possibly a myriad of things that, for whatever reason, are not quickly, efficiently, monetarily rewarded in the society.
A student is well, depending on the kind of student, it's a bet, right? It's a bet from society on.
Indulge me. What kind of student should be sterilized?
I'm not saying I'm in favor of sterilization. I said it would work, right? But the alternative, historically, is to keep the welfare state at a very low level and just sort of shame it. Shame using, public welfare. And that has the effect of lowering, fitness of the people who are on welfare. So that's a form of a feedback loop.
You want to lower the fitness of the people who are on welfare.
Well, lower the fitness, as I've discussed with Nathan earlier, means, in this case, lower the number of offspring on average, right? If it is shameful in a sense to be on the dole of the state, then it is harder to find a mate, isn't it? And then, yeah.
Well, no. Otherwise, you wouldn't be suggesting sterilizing them, right?
Well, that's something I suggested because the modern welfare state is a lot more expensive, well, a lot more, I should say, ample than it was in the past. Like, you always had some degree of welfare, often in the form of religious or public charity, right? But compared to what it is now, it was not as systematic and far-reaching.
Yeah, and it didn't really work a whole lot. People were starving. Again, they overthrew the king over this.
Right.
So,
but that's right. But that's the thing, right? With or without welfare, we're getting there, is what I'm saying. Is that, well, I'm sorry, I'm losing some coherence because
no,
I'm
it's fine.
kind of
This is
tired.
actually an appropriate preamble to. I believe it's an appropriate preamble. I'm going in blind to a stream response I was about to do in a few minutes. So if you're exhausted, you've been on for like an hour. I'm happy to continue this again another time, and I'll let you collect your thoughts.
Okay, it's fine. I'll just continue for a bit about this. Like,
yeah, sure.
It's a, I don't know. It's a theoretical argument that makes anyone that phrases it look like a horrible person, which is why it is never made in public. Which is why you don't.
I disagree with that very strongly. I don't think stigmatization of the poor and the unemployed is something that is not done very often in public.
Well, stigmatization, sure, but
well, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about making them look intrinsically bad for being those things.
Right.
Like for example, like here's
the fact
here's
that we
where
have this cultural trait is a relatively good thing, I would say. But I mean, the whole argument about the risk of systematized far-reaching welfare, like that's an example of altruism being taken advantage of.
So here's what's rolling around in the back of my head while I'm listening to you explain this.
Right.
Why are you fetishizing the idea of a plentiful society that can afford to give people the material resources to live full lives as human beings, to be able to do creative things? Why are you fetishizing their enslavement to dead-end jobs that make them basically want to be poor as opposed to working them, on the most uncharitable view of the poor that you could possibly take as being, as you put it, freeloaders?
Because
why is that preferable?
I think abundance is self-defeating without a regulatory feedback loop. Because as we were discussing with Nathan, life forms always reproduce in excess of their resources.
We aren't single-celled organisms, though. We create our environment. We technologically counter the selection processes endemic to the natural world. That's why there's that phrase, animals have biology, human beings have history. We build our world such that it produces the things that we want.
We have a society which works according to emergent rules, which are not the same as biological rules. But this society exists within a larger context, a larger biological context. And we are still very much defined.
What is that? Elaborate. What is that biological context?
Evolution still is working on humans. Like, anytime you have either premature deaths in any kind of a systematic way, or
okay, so at this point, again, now we're starting to look at subsections within humanity. We're not talking about species survival, and this is why Nathan from Digital Gnosis was starting to anticipate that this is going to go into a very sketchy area.
Right. Well, depending on who you're talking about this with, that's for sure going to...
Well, it's a kind of definitionally the case. So, for example, as a result of the recent history of the past couple hundred years, there are racial disparities in levels of poverty in the United States and in Canada. And what you are suggesting would effectively result, as has been tried already, by the way, the sterilization on racial grounds.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, it's not on racial grounds, though. And this is kind of key. Because the thing that's retarded about the people who did this on racial grounds is that they think, which is what I started by saying, they think white people are magic. They think, okay, we should just get rid of black people and somehow we are out of the woods. Somehow evolution doesn't apply to white people. So I don't know what you're on about. It's like,
Well, no,
yeah, sure.
Their point is precisely that evolution does apply to white people, and they don't want to privilege other competing groups.
Well, then in that case, they're talking about groups.
Because as you put it, altruism doesn't evolve.
Altruism doesn't evolve. Yeah, but I'm talking about the individual level. The thing is, they believe...
Yeah, but we don't... Natural selection applies at the level of the species. The selection involves the deaths of members of a species to select properties of the species.
Right?
Yeah.
That is correct.
Yeah.
But so selection... sorry. Selection applies to... Yeah, a population evolves. Traits could be said to evolve. I'm sorry, I don't know what you were arguing about.
I think I'm arguing that it's not a viable.
I was just saying that this is not a racial thing, and that
I understand that you don't think it's. Slow down. I understand that you don't think it's a racial thing. No, I understand that you don't think it's a racial thing, but practically speaking, it ends up being a racial thing.
Well, yeah, considering there are differences in the circumstances of different races, it would impact different races differently. Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, for sure, actually.
Now let's think of this in purely amoral terms. Again, if you mark out subsets of your society for effective extermination, how are they going to be disposed towards you?
Well, they're not going to be disposed very well, of course.
No.
I wouldn't like that.
So what happens if you have massive subsets of your population that hate the community they're in?
Well, that's why you don't select out like 50% of the population. Like I'm at 5% or something like that.
Okay.
If your goal is to have a stable society, you wouldn't want to, of course, like have it be toppled by, getting on the bad side of the majority. But that's a case.
Okay,
of,
so do you think that this?
Sorry,
so
that's
hang on. So
individual and collective, interest, right? That's a conflict between individual and collective interest, and
I mean,
I just guess
a healthy society would be one in which the individual interest is synonymous with the collective interest. This seems to
that can't be always true, though, right?
Of course, it's not always true, but that you need to have that be a possibility. If you're in a situation where everybody in the lower classes is afraid of falling into poverty because they'll be sterilized, that immediately frames the community as not just an other, but as an antagonist. That's a very bad state of affairs.
Right. Well, I don't know.
I would strongly deny applying any evolutionary terms to politics at all. But insofar as we're doing so, altruism is intrinsic. We've seen, that's the one thing that we've seen over and over again over the past 300 years, is that an anti-altruistic society is one which dies very, very quickly.
Well, I wouldn't say so. Because what's an anti-altruistic society? Like at the level of the
it doesn't need to be entirely altruistic, but when you have a deficit of it, if you have a society in which the interest of the state is put exclusively against the interest of any individual member of it,
right?
Yeah.
Well, I think now you actually understand why we have that pretense of morality that is there all the time, right?
Okay, but the fact that individuals
narrative. Because
but the fact that people pretend to have moral concerns or to be motivated by moral concerns is not a byway to say that morality is an illusion.
Well, that's the thing, right? Morality can be used for almost anything. Like if a state needs its citizens to behave in a certain way, it could. Well, it's not that it could just define morality, right? But morality is very flexible. Like you have cases where it is moral to go and kill the men from the other tribe to seize their territory, for instance. Like morality is just what
No,
we
that
make
would
it.
be. I mean,
Yeah, it's a sacred war. It's like, I don't know. You're
okay.
you're
Well,
not
what
you're
do
not
you?
killing
Okay,
these
so
guys. You're fighting evil.
okay, what do we? What do you mean by morality? If you had to put it down specifically.
Okay, so let me recuperate that. It's a non-perspective dependent collective value. It has to be collective.
Okay, but collective is a perspective, right?
It's a collective value, and yeah, that's why it doesn't exist.
Okay, so
Because a non-perspective dependent collective value, like we have collective values, right? For instance, stability or like valuing civilization as a
no.
society.
If those
Is
were
it?
collective values, we wouldn't have a wealthy elite that doesn't care about the condition of the poor. That, as a consequence of that, doesn't care about the condition of their community as a whole.
I just said
We almost lack collective values, generally speaking. It almost defines the modern condition.
that's true. The thing is that a value doesn't have to be good for like anyone but the person who uses it. Like I value not putting my hand on the stove, for instance. It's a value. A value is just X is good and Y is bad.
That's not a value. That's like typically when we talk about values, we're talking about things that are privileged in a determination about what you ought to accomplish or what you ought to do or what you ought not to do. So I may value I may value family, for example, and so I will make decisions that conduce to the well-being of my family and avoid decisions that do the opposite.
Right. What you're describing with the out thing is a moral value. A value is
with what ought thing? With the ought thing?
Yeah, with the alt, right? The
alt.
is out gap. Alt. Sorry about that.
Oh.
Sorry. Like a value is.
I don't think I was. So the is-ought gap is simply saying that you can't derive an ought from the state of things.
Yeah, no, I wasn't using the is-out gap to make a point. I was using the is-out gap to say that was the word I was using.
Oh, I see. Okay, fair enough. Keep going.
So maybe this isn't a philosophically defined term usually, right? But I define a value as like X is good, Y is bad, Z is good, something like that, right?
Okay, but that's not a value. That would in itself be a moral determination, right?
Not a moral one. Like it doesn't have to be moral. I value getting money, and this is not a moral pursuit, right? I value not putting my hand on the stove.
No, but that's my
not
point.
A moral
like I don't think like this is good, this is bad.
This is bad to me, this is good to me. These are examples of individual values, right?
I don't think that accounts for what we actually pack into the word value. I think when we talk about values, there's a directionality to them. It's not just the judgment that this is good, this is bad. It's the judgment that this is a thing about which I will act to bring about.
Right. I was going to go in your direction that usually when you talk about values, we are talking about more abstracted values, like a higher level of value. We don't usually, well, I won't explicitly think that, but my actions are directed by the fact that I think that eating an apple is good to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now I could question that value and say, why is eating an apple good to me? Because I value my health, right? Why do I value my health? Because I value the continuity of my existence. Why do I value the continuity of my existence?
So hang on. So at that level, you'll be talking about values.
Right. At that level, I'm talking about values. What I'm saying is that you can have large scale, like sort of theoretical abstract values, which is granted, which is what we're usually talking about when we talk about values. And then you have all sorts of derivative little values that you use to guide your actions in day-to-day life, right? Because in order to take a decision, it has to be like motivated by an intention. And in order to have an intention, has to have a direction, and the direction is,
Okay.
is given by a value, right?
Okay, bring this back to how the fact that morality can be used to justify anything by cynical elites indicates that morality is
Well,
not.
that's what I was saying. You have individual values, and then you have collective values, and collective values are something that emerges at the level of a society, at some, or a village, right? Something that has cohesion and can be considered to be an agent.
I
Right?
see what's going on.
Something that can have an intention, right? It can have a
Okay.
collective value
Are
if it
you
has an intention.
yeah? Are you familiar with the distinction in ethics between morality? Well, not in ethics, but in moral and ethical philosophy. Are you familiar with the distinction between ethics and morality? Like, do you know what they are?
Not really. I think
Okay.
they are almost synonymous.
Not exactly. They're sometimes used synonymously in a vulgar way, but they're really quite distinct. So, ethics is a word that goes way back. It comes from the Greek and it refers to the character of a thing in general terms. So, if you read Aristotle's Ethics, he is almost unconcerned entirely with individual human actions. He's concerned with the personal qualities that a society cultivates in its subjects or in its citizens that then leads to them performing certain kinds of actions or having certain kinds of other derivative qualities.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that. Can you repeat it? So,
Sure. So
right.
if you look, for example, at Aristotle's Ethics,
Right.
He talks virtue ethics generally is concerned with the qualities of a subject, whereas morality is typically concerned with the decisions that a subject takes in time. So
Okay.
ethics is essentially a political science, especially in Aristotle, because it's concerned primarily with setting up a situation that produces good qualities in people such that they make what we now call moral decisions. Morality, by contrast, is concerned specifically with those decisions themselves. So that's why in Kant, when you look at the grounder for the metaphysics of morals, it gets reduced down to literally just willing the good is morality in its purest form. Whereas ethics, now you get into all of his practical philosophy, where he is now concerned with things to do with, law, institutions, stuff like that.
All right. Well, then morality and ethics is.
So when you're talking about the ontology of morality, you're not talking about values themselves. What you're talking about is the existence of moral duties. And that's going to be downstream from ethics.
Well, that's okay. So in that case, if I use your terminology, morality, like a moral imperative is like an individual perspective independent value.
It's not a value. It's not a value.
Yes, it's something that guides a decision. It's something that gives you, it's this is good or this is bad. This action is good or this action is bad. This is a moral precept, right? So this is a kind of a value. It's just a value that is thought of as not coming from the subject. And my claim is that all values come from the subject. Like, only brains can produce values.
Well, hang on a sec, because the whole point to distinguishing morality from practical concerns is specifically that you yourself do not take personal value in the decision. Otherwise, we would invoke that other practical value in the description of the quote-unquote moral decision made.
Right.
Whereas the entire point to distinguishing between that and morality is that the moral decision is one that is universally the good decision, irrespective of values. This is one of the reasons why you get sort of perverse readings of Kant, where it's actually more moral to hate the good thing that you're doing, and why we identify the moral with the altruistic almost instinctively.
So a person that does a certain action could think that in their head that they would rather do something else, but they're being constrained by some moral principle. But be it the personal value that they recognize as such or the moral principle, all of those were nested in their brains to begin with. What I'm saying is that this is a distinction without a difference, or this is, in a sense, an illusion. This is something we tell ourselves as an excuse.
An excuse for what?
To do what we want.
That doesn't make a lot of sense, because the moral tends to be, I mean, it's definitionally that which inconveniences us, or at the very least does inconvenience us, and it almost always inconveniences us.
Yeah, in some cases, values reflect social conventions or social pressures. And in that case, it might not be what the individual wants, and he might or she might like experience it as an external constraint. But yeah, this is in this case like
and insofar
what I call a collective value. Yeah.
Yeah, and insofar as somebody is operating according to those external constraints for any other reason than willing the good, like say, for example, to avoid punishment or to get clout, as you put it, then they're not making the morally, they're not doing a moral good ultimately. They're doing something else. But again, that's not a byway to say that the moral is illusory. It may be that it's simply humanly impossible, but that's different.
Okay, well, I don't think I'm going to make a lot more sense than that.
That's fine.
And well,
it seems to me that what you're doing effectively is, are you familiar with, have you read Plato's Republic by chance?
Plato's Republic, I have it on the shelf. I've never read it.
Okay, it's worth it. So in the first,
yeah,
so the book concerns, it's covers a wide array of topics, but it's primarily focused on the question of what is justice. And in the first book, I can't remember if this trails into the second book. I think it's just the first book. It's been a little while. Yeah, it's the first book. Different characters in the dialogue give different arguments for justice that are then interrogated and taken apart. And one of the later ones is by a sophist called Thrasymachus, and his argument is that justice is the interest of the strong. And he's making a sneaky little conflation there, because he's not actually saying that the interest of the strong is justice. What he's saying is, justice doesn't exist. What we call justice is merely the interest of the strong, right? That seems to be what you're doing here. And the problem is it doesn't actually get at the question of, is there morality? It simply says, it simply declares, quite rightly, that 9 times out of 10, when somebody says something is moral, they're doing so for dishonorable reasons. Which, I mean, is fair enough, but that doesn't touch the existence of morality at all. We're simply talking about something else.
Well, and the 10 times they're lying to the 10th time where they're doing it for absolutely selfless reason, psychologically, they are lying to themselves, is my point.
Okay, but then they're lying to themselves. That would be an anthropological statement that human beings cannot or simply categorically fail to be moral, but that would not eliminate the category of the moral from the real, right?
Well, okay. It makes it into a delusion of sorts, right?
How so?
It makes it into, well, when you are lying to yourself, you are deluding yourself, right?
Sure, but that doesn't make morality a delusion, does it?
Well,
that makes your morality a delusion, perhaps, but not morality by itself. When we're talking about morality qua morality, that is untouched by any anthropological concern. That's why Kant is very explicit about removing all elements of the human from it. That's why he's often critiqued for making the categorical imperative completely empty, because it practically is. It's an orientation ultimately towards the good, whatever that means apart from the human.
You are asserting that as though it was a principle that is outside of brains, as it was a principle that is, I don't know, like a Platonic solid of some sort, right?
Sort of. It's something that's directly implied, again, by our use of the word moral, and that it always refers to, again, a universal imperative apart from any practical purpose.
Don't you find it a tiny bit suspicious that, like an evolved being, that we should expect to have acquired traits that favors it to create self-delusions that favor itself, right? No, sorry. Don't you? I'm trying to make this into one sentence, and it's.
If you want to start over, that's fine.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Let me think for 10 seconds.
Sure.
um, don't you find it plausible that an evolved being that we expect to have a sense of self-advocacy at all times, and that we expect to have like all sorts of ad hoc principles just there to further his goals? Don't you find it suspicious that such a being would cling to that idea of a platonically solid value just out there, outside of his brain, directing his actions and justifying that he is the good guy if he follows the thing that is outside of him?
Oh, sure. And that's why, again, the moral, if we're being consistent with our use of the term, is going to, again, be removed of any of those benefits. So it's quite arguable that while the moral is absolutely predicable of rational beings that can will the good in a rational way, which is, again, by being rational means that we can will the good deliberately, that simply may be something that's beyond us because our humanness simply overtakes it. But that's the point. Kant is skeptical of exactly the same thing that you are.
Well, in that case, I don't understand why he would not just reject the term. Because it seems to me that it's not a thing. It's just, it may be a thing in ethics books, right? In philosophy books, but in this case, it's not it's just a justification, essentially.
Well, it's equivalent to the rational ultimately.
To the rational.
There isn't a giant blue bar in the Platonic world of forms that represents the good, and then a red bar that represents the bad in moral terms.
But in that case, what I'm asking is, why do you want to cling to the word, right, to the term?
Well, because we are rational beings, we can make an effort to be as rational as possible, and we prefer that. Like when we, again, this is again when you look at the moral qua the moral, it's always going to make reference to some ultimate thing. In the case of well, I mean, it's directly baked into the way in which we use the language, because as soon as we invoke something else other than the most rational and the best, then we're talking about, we make morality superfluous. We're now talking about just something else and we're slapping a label onto it, which is the point you would make. But that by itself wouldn't actually remove the moral from the equation. We can say that there is in fact a most rational decision to make in a particular case, or a most rational end. It may simply be the case that human beings are incapable of either,
in that case, you're defining
actualizing the
morality
most rational end, or of getting over their own contingency to will the most rational end. But that by itself doesn't mean there isn't a most rational end.
Right. So actually, you're defining morality as like the most rational outcome, right? Well, not outcome, the most rational decision, sort of.
Sure. How would you define it against that? Like if you're going to say, if you're going to say that,
I don't know. I think it's kind of misleading to call like essentially what is the optimal choice morality, because it's never going to be. Well, morality has universalism baked into it, right? But the best choice is sometimes like completely incompatible from one individual to the next, or from the collective to the individual.
Can you rephrase that? I had trouble following that.
Yeah, sorry. So you're saying that the most rational decision is the moral one, right?
Oh well, and, I mean, you are saying that you're invoking things like values. You're saying that there are specific ends that we have to which we work, and there's either going to be there's going to be greater values than those, of course, which will ratify these lower values that we have. So, like for example, I may value my own well-being, but I may value my own well-being to the extent that I actually cause active harm to the community in which my well-being is, upon which my well-being is predicated.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's your optimal choice, right? And you can see that this optimal choice is not the optimal choice for society. So you have a conflict on your hands between individual and collective interest, or individual and collective morals in this case, right?
Well, you're just
because the best decision from your perspective is not the best decision from society's perspective, or from another person in that society's perspective.
yeah, that could be the case. Yeah.
So in this case, we are back to individual values, not morals.
No, not really though. We're just making the anthropological observation that human beings. No, we're just making the observation that human beings
outside of morality. You just took morality and agreed to like leave the universalism out of it.
No, I didn't.
Okay. Well, I misunderstood then.
Yes, again, like you're making an anthropological observation that human beings often are, when you actually put the pressure on, they're not actually moral. That's all you're saying.
Right? And this moral principles, well, okay, yeah, you wish to redefine it.
Well, I'm not redefining it.
Okay, you wish
I'm not again, like,
okay,
look.
Not redefine it, but define it as the most rational decision. I don't think it's that simple. I think the most rational decision is going to be very different depending on who you ask. And like it's
No, it's not, because again, rationality is not it's not agent specific. It's not. Your rational your self-interest can extend to the point of being irrational, right?
I wouldn't call it irrational. It's not irrational if it goes over other people's.
Slow down. Like let's say your activity is immensely destructive of the world, but it gets you a tremendous amount of personal wealth and aggrandizement in your life. But at the end of it, there's nothing left because you've contributed to the destruction of the world. There's no memory of you. You die anyways, and you're actually in net terms, even if you wanted to assert that you could actually
I wouldn't call it irrational.
privilege your individual self-interest over that of the entire world, which gives you your meaning and your own identity and significance.
Right.
Even on those terms, that would be flattened.
I wouldn't call it irrational. I would call it self-defeating, and you can have self-defeating outcomes. You can be rational every step of the way and end up with a self-defeating outcome, is what I'm saying. Like that's actually an observation from game theory.
What would you call
get a tragedy of the commons from everyone's following their own individual interest, from everyone making rational decisions?
Okay. Do you know what another way of saying irrational is?
Do tell.
Self-defeating. It's a logic that is self-defeating.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with that distinction, actually.
Okay. Elaborate, please.
An action can be collectively self-defeating, while it can be still rational to follow it through. Like, for instance,
I think you're conflating rational with reasonable, as in we would observe this person making the irrational decision, yet understand why they made it.
Okay, I guess I see your point.
Yeah. All right, I've got to move on to another stream, but I'm happy to continue this when you're not so exhausted. I think this was a bit unfair. Okay. And you know what? I think.
Well, it was enjoyable.
Yeah, it was absolutely.
It's the middle of the night.
Oh, is it? I'm on my second dose of my COVID vaccine, so it may as well be the middle of the night. It makes you sort of retroactively not
It's
have
for
slept for 2 days. So-
it's for in the morning. So yeah.
Oh, actually, that's in the middle of the night. That is morning. So you should get some sleep. Anyways, thanks for doing this. Let's chat later, either here or on Digital Gnosis.
Have a good one, and I hope you don't think I'm too much of an asshole. I'm really trying very hard not to be.
Oh no, I wasn't getting that impression at all. That being said, I do think with a bit of prodding, I could show you how you're kind of de facto there anyways. It's sort of folded into your positions. I don't think you're malicious though, if that's what you're worried about.
Like, there are things that I believe are not necessarily bad, that everyone believe are bad, and I think I'm right and they're wrong. Like, and this is a very non-politically correct thing, but like, for instance, the idea of eugenics, not the practice of it, I don't think is necessarily bad. And I think it could be, in a sense, even necessary. But sounds horrible, because
this was the wrong part of the conversation to bring that up.
Right.
I'll tell you what. Let's do that conversation.
I know. Yeah, we should do that another time. But I'll just explain it. Like, I've always defined myself as a moderate at heart, and the only reason I would end up advocating for something like that is because I would like genuinely believe that the alternative is worse.
I'll tell you what.
I guess is what I'm saying.
Just for this, for the sake of clarity, give me an example of a eugenic policy that is okay on your frame.
Favoring long-term stability of society by like encouraging people with, say, necessary traits to reproduce.
Would you consider the the tendency to reproduce a necessary trait?
No, that will take care of itself.
That will take care of itself.
Yes, because
You
anyone
sure?
because anyone
Okay,
who
I want you to do me
reproduces-
something before we have our conversation. I want you to go look at birth rates among higher income in higher income countries, and then come back and tell me that
well, I am
we
familiar with
should
the
sterilize the poor, and that will conduce to stability. All right, I'm gonna sign off now because I'm going into the next
This is going to be a
stream,
long talk
but,
if I continue. So okay.
What's that?
This is going to be a long talk if I continue, but
Yes, it will be. So we'll do this. We'll do this another time.
have a good one, anyways.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Goodbye.